modeling, right? Which provided an alternative to CGE models and showed that a minimum wage in South Africa would raise wages, particularly for the lowest earners, increase household income, and thus expenditure, and thus raise aggregate demand, right? It countered some of the other models. And so while employment may decline slightly, particularly in some sectors, the tagline that you read in the newspapers is that in most sectors it was not a statistically significant impact on employment. And there's a power to that, to be able to say, our modeling shows that X intervention will have a positive effect on Y, and a statistically insignificant effect on X, right? And particularly for decision makers who are faced with competing priorities, under pressure to account for the financial impact of intervention, to project into the future and think, well, what will the impact of this thing I'm voting for actually be, and will I get reelected, right? These projections provide something to latch onto, right? And for advocates as well, because in some ways it can reduce the political tension. It takes the struggle from the streets, right? And it takes it into the halls of technocratic discussions, right? And that can be an important tool. So I don't mean at all to discount it, but of course it also runs the risk of demobilizing the rank and file or actually advancing policies without adequate mobilization. So as a labor organizer, and then when I switched to this policy world, my former supervisor, and my current supervisor here, my former supervisor was someone called Francie Lund, who is a trained social worker and sociologist, and has been instrumental in so many policy processes in South Africa. And she gave me this very useful piece of advice as someone who's not an economist. Right? She said, when listening to economists, you need to close your eyes, put your hands on your temple, sift through all that economistic language, identify the assumptions, evaluate their arguments, and don't be afraid to challenge. When reading the findings, don't get snowed in by the alienating formula. Read the abstract, the first paragraphs, but also check critically to make sure how the sample has selected and such. Whatever you do, don't ever, ever recoil, right? And why this is important is because oftentimes there's this supremacy that reduces, that makes those who are not trained in economics feel that they're unable to engage. And part of, I know that this panel is called What Can Economics Learn from Social Sciences, but part of it is about how it is that we create spaces where we can actually be engaging in political economy. So there's a recent study that's been done on the UBI, on the Universal Basic Income, just to give you an example of the kind of different types of questions one can ask in economics and other social sciences. And UBI is a universal, unconditional, publicly funded cash transfer paid to all individuals. And there's been a growing interest in UBI as scholars and policymakers and activists brace for what I sometimes term the apocalyptic workless future, right? In which technological progress replaces human bodies with robots, and wages and working conditions and workplace struggles become irrelevant, right? This UBI has been embraced by both the right and the left. I recently read the World Development Report, which identified a targeted guaranteed social income as a response to increasing automation and a mechanism for innovation, along with, easing rigid labor market regulations, right? So that's sort of a more conservative embracing of a UBI. And on the progressive front, it's also been embraced because it delinks the provision of basic needs, sort of, though most of the proposals for a UBI would certainly not cover basic needs, but it delinks the provision of basic needs from participation in the labor market, and it strengthens workers' negotiating power and working conditions while enabling the poor to invest in their own activities. And sometimes then these arguments become highly instrumentalized to try to appeal to tendencies. Now, there's been some recent studies that have been done, one of which is a macroeconomic modeling of what the impact would be actually of a UBI. Because one of the arguments is that this is actually not sustainable and highly expensive. The study finds that in fact, a UBI would lead to economic growth in the US, and that it makes absolutely a lot of sense to invest in it. And so the argument becomes that you look at data around deindustrialization in the US, you conclude that there's a process of the apocalyptic end of work. You then do this modeling and decide that a UBI is actually possible, and that becomes a solution. Now, my research is around the equivalent of an EPWP program in Mozambique. And what it raises, on one hand, is, well, what are actually the changing patterns of work, right? And much of the data that is being used cannot simply be taken from the US and then implanted in a place like Mozambique. That has a dramatically different insertion into the regional political and global political economy, and a labor market that is perhaps transforming in quite different ways. And so it becomes important actually to do the kind of sociological work to understand, well, how this work takes place and what are the social relations that evolve in that. What is the meaning of work, right? So there's this assumption that the UBI will replace wage employment. But does work actually have some kind of intrinsic value? Some would argue no, that it's just a desire for integration into the society. But those are, again, questions that sociology would delve into. And how are these meanings historically constructed and historically contested over time? So I know that we don't have a lot of time, but I wanted to throw out, those are examples of questions that are a little bit different from the kinds of debates that have been happening around the UBI, but that are important. And one of the things that I conclude in my work right now is that actually work does have a series of meanings, and that what many of the people who could be potential UBI recipients in Mozambique really would like is, rather than having an EPWP, a well-paid job, right? And that work continues to exist, that there is much work to be done in rural Mozambique, but the thing is that there hasn't been the investment to actually employ people to do that kind of work, opening of roads, maintenance, etc. So I will leave it there and not talk so much about what we can talk about next time in the national after. Thanks.
And now we will pass over to Robert Benita.
So you might something again?
Or you?
I think I don't care what the order is. But,
Okay, no, anyway, we'll go.
Yeah. Well, how much time? I guess.
Use the microphone.
Okay. If anyone of you is familiar with a British, in particular, economists should learn from philosophy, and that, of course, is an impossible brief. There is absolutely no way, given the breadth and depth of this kind of question, that I can do justice in 15 minutes. Even if I limited myself to just one author, one school, or follow one time period, not possible to do. The reason for that is that, as many people in this room will know, if you think about the relationships between economics and philosophy in particular, economics, like most disciplines that we recognize as separate sciences today, wasn't born independently from philosophy, but was born out of philosophy. I don't know what the current state is, however, the founders were all philosophers in one way or another. Adam Smith, the author of The Celebrated Wealth of Nations, saw economics as an extension of philosophy, and his book grew out of lectures on moral philosophy that he gave in university. The Wealth of Nations, incidentally, I think is the one book that has probably caused the greatest amount of suffering in the history of humanity, with the exception of the Bible, perhaps, closely followed by Das Kapital and Marx. So, other founders of economics were equally philosophers, as everyone knows. John Stuart Mill wrote a leading textbook on classical philosophy, economics in the 19th century. He was also a very important philosopher. Marx, if you read Marx, this philosophical manuscript from the later period, you read him on human nature, on property, you realize that he was as much philosopher as an economist. And then there's Maynard Keynes, who said that economics previously is also a science in moral science, in fact. And Hayek was also a philosopher of science and some of the epistemology as well. So the grand figures were all influential economists, the founders were all philosophers. And I think that mathematics coincidence. Bruce Young's in American philosophy likes to philosophize a lot about Africa. And place matters, of course, especially that we're in an African place. So I want to give you just a brief, propose a brief reflection on how philosophy in this African place was born. And given the intersections between economics and philosophy at a deeper level, it could be that the choice between these schools and methods could also be a philosophical one. And in this place, it could be a choice it could be a question in African philosophy. So this is the idea that I want to toy with. Could it be that methodological theory choice in economics that it is influenced by your philosophical views on a number of questions? Now, you might say, oh, he's a philosopher, right? So of course he was going to say that. There's a saying that says, if you're a hammer, every problem looks like a nail to you. And if I'm a philosopher, every problem is going to look like a philosophical problem to me. If you think that, just please bear with me. I've got two African philosophers whose views I think whose views I want to talk about today, whose views I think are relevant to the question that I asked, which is maybe a choice of African economics, if there is such a thing, there's to be such a thing, is going to be influenced by a position in African philosophy. So the first one is Mtonji. He's a Beninese or Benin philosopher. Now, what's less well known, I think, is that the fact that his position on this methodology in African philosophy, which is ethnophilosophy, actually springs from a specific view of science that he had, and the nature of philosophy and how the two relate. So to give you a flavor of how he writes and how he thinks, I'll give you a couple of quotations from Mtonji. He says, African philosophy, quote, like African science, or African culture in general, is before us, not behind us, and must be created today by decisive action. And he adds immediately that this doesn't mean that African philosophy or science should be created ex nihilo, but rather that it will be necessary to embrace the heritage of the past. But the way this is done should not be in a way that amounts to a withdrawal into the past, which is what he thinks ethnophilosophy is. So he says, quote, we shall never create an authentic African philosophy, a genuine philosophy, genuinely African, if we skirt around the existing philosophical tradition. It's not by skirting around, and still less by ignoring the international philosophical heritage, that we shall really philosophize, but by absorbing it in order to transcend it. So that's Mtonji on African philosophy. What's that got to do with economics? Well, he claims that philosophy isn't a static system, but an open-ended dialogue, a collective quest for truth. And in that respect, it is no different from science. In fact, philosophy is nothing more than reflection on the aims of science, end of quote. He derives his view from an interpretation of Plato, Plato's discussion of knowledge in the Meno. So to him, neither philosophy nor science are static systems, but rather histories. Open, endless processes in which search for knowledge by a succession of doctrines that explicitly address each other, refute, confirm each other, etc., that produce, in the end, a discursive chain of reasons, that justify our beliefs and that transform our beliefs from mere true beliefs to knowledge. And it's because philosophy and science share these characteristics that he thinks that there can't be a collective philosophy or an African philosophy, which would first have to be sort of unearthed by anthropologists, which is the goal of ethnophilosophy. Why? It's because that while digging up the collective worldview, a system of implicit propositions or beliefs to which all individuals who make up a given society adhere, isn't what science looks like in its practice. And therefore, it isn't also what philosophy should look like. So African philosophy can't be separated from African science in Mtonji's view. It is actually organically linked to the development of science. And if philosophy is to be of any use, it would be only by helping to liberate a genuine theoretical tradition on this continent an open scientific tradition which is master of its problems and of its themes, that would be the role of philosophy. So Ontonji has got this interesting and very complex position according to which science is A, a discursive science, is a discursive practice, a to and fro of doctrines, and B, consists in the collective weighing, evaluating, elaborating of reasons. And because he thinks that this is what science is, he isn't prepared to call pre-colonial African knowledge science. He says pre-colonial Africa had amassed a wealth of true knowledge, of effective techniques which have been transmitted orally from generations to generation, and continue to this day to ensure the livelihood of a large part of the population. But precisely because we speak of recording and systematizing it in order to integrate it into our modern knowledge, it must be admitted that of itself it could not have produced that specific form of knowledge that we refer to as vaguely as modern knowledge. End of quote. Now, Ontonji is not reactionary though. He emphasizes the necessity of recovering the African heritage. This is that this sort of recovery isn't a matter of spontaneously developing traditional wisdom into a modern epitome. Rather, it's a matter of enveloping the traditional wisdom by the modern epitome. That's a quote from Barcelona that he used. So he's got this view of modernity for in and for Africa, which is neither an absorption of the international heritage in order to transcend it, but the reclamation of traditional African wisdom and its integration into international wisdom. So I presume that this would be the genuinely scientific way of proceeding if one were to create an African economics. And I note that in closing, Ontonji says that this kind of project presupposes, quote, the elaboration of a methodology that may not be the exclusive business of scientists, but that of philosophers also, end of quote. So African economics, just like African philosophy, I suppose Ontonji would say, doesn't exist yet. It lies before us. Now, I said I was going to talk about two philosophers. There's another philosopher who disagrees sharply with Ontonji. It's important to say that not everyone agrees with him. In fact, there's a wide spectrum of people who object to Ontonji, and I think one of the most sort of stark exponents of that is Jonathan Chimakonam, who is a Nigerian philosopher from the University of Calabar, who published a book called Introducing African Science. And he says in that book, he suggests that what Ontonji calls African heritage, African traditional wisdom, African pre-colonial knowledge, is in fact African science, in the full sense of the term. And that's because for Chimakonam, the solutions to a people's problems are usually found within their environment. This environment spans from tradition, religion, to a customary framework. And since scientific knowledge is in part a response to environmental challenges, the environment to a large extent determines the structure of science, end of quote. So Chimakonam says, look, Western science is sprung from the traditions of and thought systems of the Western people, and in much the same pattern, African science springs from the traditions of African peoples. It is an intellectual as well as a practical reaction to one's environment. And so a specific science, by definition, squares well with the challenges of its specific environment. He quotes the American feminist philosopher Sandra Harding, who said that Western science is nothing but a local science, an ethno-science. And the only difference is that it was proposed to us as a universal science, as supposedly universal. But it's nothing but local ethno-science. And so if Western science is nothing but local ethno-science, then the equally local African science has just as much entitlement to be called Western science. But Western and African environments are different. And so Chimakonam says we should expect the African environment to engender a science that is different from Western science, specifically from a metaphysical and an ontological point of view. This is because, according to him, the way, this is a quote, we Africans look at reality is different from the way European and the Asian look at reality. Their possibilities are not always our possibilities, and ours may not always be theirs. There's no rule that validates theirs and invalidates ours. So, whereas Western science is the pursuit of a body of knowledge about the empirical world, African science, according to Chimakonam, is the inquiry into reality in all its shades. So, and Western science is a failure to acknowledge that the metaphysical as part of the physical is actually one of its greatest weaknesses. African science, for its part, has always recognized that there's the physical, the non-physical, as well as the union of the two. A weakness of African science, according to Chimakonam, is a certain lack of organization and structure. And so he thinks that the task of African philosophy is actually to systematize African science. But systematizing African science, for him, is not about integrating it with Western science, or even showing that its methods, criteria, explanations, etc. are consistent with it. Rather, systematization requires explaining the principles behind basic African assumptions and thoughts, and the basic assumptions of African scientific practice. So Chimakonam says that, those who argue that what I call African science is actually just mythical knowledge or magic are just opposed to the very idea of an autonomous and authentic African science. And he reminds us that the standards and the criteria of Western science are not those of African science. And it's not by being accepted by Western science that makes a given body of knowledge a science or a philosophy. It's rather what works for a given people. And to illustrate this idea, he quotes an equal aphorism which says, "The firewood found in any nation is what cooks for the natives." It's what works. And he pursues this line of thought to what seems to be its logical conclusion and says, in fact, excellence for an African and a Westerner is tied to their unique thought systems. So Africans, as a result, he says, can never think successfully within the Western thought system, and vice versa. Yeah. So he may be a fairly extreme example of a view which one might call traditionalist. He, I'm sure, would completely reject that term. But one might call him traditionalist, and he's perhaps one of the most extreme ones. But he's an exponent of a current of thought that is very strong right now in contemporary African philosophical thought about science. Now, Chimakonam does not once mention the word economics in the entire book. And I wonder what he would say about African economics. How should it look like? What should it look like? Now, it seems to me, but this may be a function of just my personal ignorance, that African science, in the way Chimakonam understands the term, doesn't provide many conceptual resources for addressing the problems of economics for Africa. To be fair to him, he does recognize, in an aside, the need to adopt some of the advances of the West by adapting them to African thought systems. And Untonji recognizes that a new methodology might be necessary for integrating African traditional thought with Western thought. So perhaps there is actually some common ground that could be found between these two very, very different philosophers and their views about science. So I'll conclude that I personally don't know where to go from here in terms of our economics. I'm going to out myself as a non-economist as well. But as a philosopher of science, and as a white male foreigner, I'm an interested observer at this point, at this crossroads in the history of economics in this country and the history of ideas. But I think that maybe it's worthwhile to communicate to you what I observe, and that is that just as so many times before, important theoretical and methodological choices in economics, in this place, appear to depend on philosophy. More specifically, on our view of what African philosophy is and what African science is and how the two are related. Now, some attempts to bring to bear African philosophical and in particular ethical wisdom on our economic lives have already been made. In business ethics, for example, Funiselwa Bengo has recently argued that to overcome the inherent problems and injustices of capitalism, we need to implement a work culture in which several critical Ubuntu values and principles are emphasized. He calls the intended end result of that, such an intervention, cooperative capitalism. And I think more work could probably be done in this direction. So, to finish up, as you see, yes, to this particular philosophical hammer, our problem of this conference does indeed look like a nail, after all. Thank you very much.
And now for our final speaker.
Okay, thank you. Robert van Eyck, I'm at the School of Governance. So I think we had 2 very rich presentations here. I want to just make some observations and possibly get into discussion about something I really see from knowledge. But I want to pick up on a phrase of Robert, and that is the injustices of capitalism. I think for me that's the starting point to understand how we address economics and other disciplines in terms of our understandings and agendas of social change. And if I was to think of the area that I've been working in the last 15 or 20 years, with social policy, I think it's about a conceptual vocabulary that a radical social policy tradition offers us that privileges the social over the economic. And that's about how we understand the kinds of societies that we want to be living in. Do we want to live in, as we are in South Africa, bifurcated societies, the class, gender, race-based, which leads to kinds of extreme inequality that we see? Do we find that acceptable? Or do we have a vision of a different kind of society, or different what's described, some of the literature as a different kind of good society? Then what would be the underpinnings of that new good society? And I think that's where social policy from the radical division offers us something. And what it does is, for me, what it entails in this area of social policy is fugitiveness. This is basically social policy is about political choices, and how those political choices are inscribed in institutions that represent certain values and principles. So he says it's contested. And he argues that we move away completely from the idea that we see this warm fuzzy feeling when we talk social policy, that we're doing something good. Actually, social policy could have a completely opposite effect. What you need to do is to analyze it in the context of the political economy within which you find yourself. And in the context in which he was writing, he says it's about industrial capitalism and how industrial capitalism causes diswealthiness, how the creation of wealth, which is taxed and then socially shared, and benefit, the wider society benefits, education and health, etc. But it's at the cost of some. And you would, for example, point to the cost of the working class, of the reduction of their wealth, to their health, to the social condition. And yet, that labor is taxed by the state and the wider society benefits from it. And his approach to that is to say, well, how do we understand that? Do we accept that because of the development of capitalism, that some benefit and others do not benefit, so we have a laissez-faire approach? Well, that's just how the cards fall. Or are we willing to make a political choice to say that there should be mechanisms of what we describe as compensation? And if we decide there are mechanisms of compensation that must be put in place in response to the inequalities of industrial capitalism, how do we understand that compensation? So if we were to apply just a set of ideas of Titmus to South Africa, we would be arguing that in South Africa, yes, we do feel that there has to be compensation. For example, there's a healthcare system, but there has to be very limited compensation. That the poor and the working class can't enjoy the same quality of healthcare as the middle class and bourgeoisie in our society. Because of course we've got this very differentiated forms of healthcare provision between the public and the private sector. 50% of our total health spending goes to support 60% of the population, which is the privileged middle class. Essentially, many of us here, because university is part of the kind of medical aid industry, and therefore supporting the private sector. And so Titmus would argue that you're making a social choice. It's about supporting a certain kind of laissez-faire view of society. But he said we can make other kinds of choices. And what I find is very important about Titmus is that he introduces a new kind of conceptual vocabulary, which I think is important. He talks about the idea of diswelfare. And diswelfare are social policies which cause harm to others. So, for example, a critical case of that in the South African context again is the HIV/AIDS policies in the 1990s. Those were social policies that caused great harm. Okay? So that's the first thing he debunks, is the idea of social policy as an innate social good. He politicizes the idea of social policy. He says it's about social choices. And then he introduces the language of universalism, which I think is critical. He suggests that when you talk about poor and services for the poor, you end up with poor services. He absolutely railed against this idea that the poor should be considered a legitimate social category in terms of our analysis. He says what the poor are actually people who have been expelled from social citizenship. Immediately what he brings to the fore is the issue of inequality. He says our focus shouldn't be, quote unquote, on the poor. Our focus should be on the social organization of society and the social stratification in society and who is getting what because of, for example, their privileged position in the labor market. And then from this he evolved the theory of the social division of welfare. And he argues that social policy is not just the visible institutional forms like houses and healthcare services and so forth which you walk into. It's also about the hidden forms of welfare. And here he particularly pointed to fiscal welfare. I think that's another link in terms of understanding the economics of social change. He says fiscal welfare is also crucial. The fact that middle class people get a tax subsidy that allows them to access private healthcare, the medical aid system, is a form of social welfare. It's also a form of social choice in society about what is considered good quality health in all citizens. Okay, and if we accept that, and I think it's a very powerful argument he makes, then we'll accept that in fact those of us who have positioning, which is middle class, are actually producing forms of inequality in South Africa through our privileged access to these tax subsidies. Okay? And again, I'm trying to overlap my commentary on some of these thinkers in social policy in the South African case. If we were, for example, to look at the current debate on the national health insurance, the one thing that Minister Motsoaledi has been fighting for strenuously is the decommodification of healthcare. He argues that health is a public good, it's not a tradable commodity. Okay? That's the language, to some degree, of Titmus. It's about how a vision of a new society, the social good, is institutionalized and organized, and the impact that has on the organization of social strata in our society, the possibility for social solidarity, the possibility for redistribution. All those things come to prominence. When you go to apply it again to South Africa, we need to ask the question, why is it that we who constitute the 16% who have privileged access to private medical care, why should we have that privileged access, which amounts in fact to 20 billion rand? So the conservative economists have turned the debate on the national health insurance in South Africa into a technocratic debate about economics. And they talk about questions of affordability. Absolutely, it's affordable. And what is curious for me is how, largely in the left, there's an almost, what's the word, cacophonic silence about this radical idea, which is to establish universal healthcare service in South Africa. And how it shifts the agenda and how it links to some of Richard Titmus' thinking is he says about the middle class. So yes, it's about us now. We have to give up something. It's not about the poor. It's classically an agenda of amelioration. How do you get social grants improved so people can have basic kind of foodstuffs on their table? So it's a bigger agenda, and that bigger agenda is about social citizenship. How, in the words of one of the thinkers on that theory of social citizenship, T.H. Marshall, how do we all share in social heritage? What do we want to give up to share in social heritage? And then, importantly, and I think this is another insight from the social policy division, how do we form social alliances to achieve that? Is there a basis for social alliance between the middle class and the poor and the working class? on a minimal program of establishing universalized national health service. And what's the power of the universalized national health services? Of course, absolutely, it's about free healthcare at the point of delivery. But it's also about institutionalizing a different idea of how society can organize itself, a different idea of the good society, the public good. And then you have to look to two places about where that's been successfully achieved, despite many attempts to deconstruct the national health service idea. The one is Britain in 1948, where there was nationalization of the hospitals, an establishment of healthcare services free at the point of delivery. And it's curious now, if you look at the discourse in Britain about the 70th anniversary of the NHS, the Tory party are tripping over themselves to claim this, what they describe as national treasure, and they're rolling it. Of course, it would never have come about if the Labour Party under Attlee, particularly the role of Nye Bevan, who was a socialist within the working class leader in the 20s, pushed through this agenda against severe odds. And the same Tory party comments on Nye Bevan as this great figure who helped establish the NHS. And the Nye Bevan of the 1940s and 1950s, key Labour Party leader, was saying, I have this very special hatred in my heart for the Tory party because what they did to my communities. He lived in impoverished coal mining community in Wales. And everything that I do is about trying to transform society in a socialist direction because it's about a new form of social organization among people across society. And of course, when we talk socialist in terms of Nye Bevan, although he was influenced by Marxism, he was classically a social democrat because he thought we need to find a way of redistributing from the middle class to the working class through forms of social alliances. So it's interesting, but the point there is that the NHS in Britain has been institutionalized. There's a furious attempts on the part of the Tories to change the mechanisms of delivery, to introduce more private sector principles in the forms of delivery. But they're very aware, as in fact the President of Unison at the conference that we shared 2 weeks ago on the NHS, the lessons of the NHS for the struggle of workers here in South Africa, to establish an NHI, they will become immediately unelectable if they say we're going to completely privatize the NHS. There's one element, but the other element which I think is very important about some of the arguments that Titlis made was saying it's very important to institutionalize social policy. The institutional form, for example, like the National Health Service, because what you do is you build up a social expectation in your citizens that they're going to get free healthcare delivery run by the state as an entitlement to their citizenship. And of course, that's the case in Britain. Established in 1948, and the later generations only had the experience of healthcare free at the point of delivery. In South Africa, the middle class only had the experience, essentially, of private healthcare provision. So it hasn't been institutionalized. And there's, for me, the big battle in South Africa at the moment, from a social policy perspective, is absolutely about establishing a national health service, a universal healthcare service, completely along the lines of 1948 UK model. Free at the point of delivery, run by the state, tending to the needs of all citizens. And although, of course, interestingly, also in the British example, although in England there's been attempts to deconstruct the forms of delivery, in Wales it's been completely the opposite. The Welsh Minister of Health said, we are running our healthcare service completely along the lines of the Bevanite privilege principles. It will always be free at the point of delivery. So in Wales, when you go, you will still get free healthcare services without any costs. In Britain, you still have to make a minimal cost for prescribed medicine. So it's interesting how the politics, and of course, Nye Bevan came out of Wales, how certain of the political flavour and the institutional possibilities can also be seen across different parts of the country. So we asked ourselves, we've got 9 provinces, which I think is a fundamental block to us achieving the universal healthcare service, because we've got 9 provinces where there's different capabilities across the country. But maybe we can think of perhaps Eastern Cape putting in place a completely universalized healthcare system. It's about what is the political will to achieve that. So in summary, I think looking at some of the ideas of radical social policy, it's about different forms of welfare, it's about how do we institutionalize forms of social solidarity, how do we politicize social policy in terms of locating it within the political economy within society, And how do we retain the agenda as one that was supposed, a positive agenda on social policy has been a negative one. How do you deal with what's essentially the liberal agenda? In fact, a lot, I would argue, of the left has been complicit in that agenda around this excitement around basic income grant, which essentially is a palliative for racial capitalism. It doesn't deal with inequality. It's not a question or square about where the wealth retains. In South Africa, the wealth retains essentially the bourgeoisie and the middle class. And it's how then you redistribute. And there's a language of decommodification in social policy, S.P. Anderson talks about. How do you decommodify provision of health and education? So ensure, most importantly, and this is the other insight which I think is crucial for social for bridging the different traditions between economics and social policy. How do we put forward an agenda of social citizenship? Social citizenship is about how everyone in the society can enjoy the same cultural and social goods as everyone else. So it's not just putting a plate of food on someone's table with a social grant, it's also enabling that person to have cultural access, to see quality films, to go to the theatre, to go to an opera. That's where the agenda should shift. Inherently in that agenda is a redistributive agenda. Of course, in some respects it's also a reformist agenda. Some would argue to achieve, for example, a social democratic genuine social democratic project in South Africa. It requires social revolution because of the scale of inequality. But I think these are just, I'm trying to link up a different range of different things, theory and strategy and institutionalization of social change. And I think I would like to rather see it as a dialogue between economics and social policy rather than what Big Brother can the Little Brother. Classically being how the debate's been framed, the disciplinary debate's been framed. And I'll just conclude by one comment, and I'm hoping there are students here as well. Yeah. So what is very radical about the Fees Must Fall movement was they put the politics of universities on the agenda. They formed the social alliances. We want no one to pay for higher education. Everyone, you middle class, poor, working class, everyone pays the same. It's a very radical agenda. Inherited is a redistributive agenda. And then there was this counterattack by people like Jonathan Jansen and others saying, you're crazy, you want to give rich white kids the same possibilities of education as yourself as the poor. And then they repeated. The slogan was, we don't want to perform our poverty. It's a very prominent slogan in the university where I was previously working at Rhodes University. We don't want to say, well, you know, I come from a family, my mother was this, I was a parent, and therefore I can only afford that, and what can you give me? And of course, the observation I make is that that agenda is completely consistent with what Titmus was about, railing this idea against poor as a separate social category. And he said the way around that, strategically, you put the politics of universalism on the agenda. And then there was this retreat, and then the students got caught up in this very complicated sliding scales about, you know, how you could access free higher education. Those in a bit more fortunate social position had to pay more. And there was a displacement of a very radical politics of universalism. Because universalism is about dealing with inequality. Means testing, the sliding scale is about stigmatization, which is what it was also railed against. How people have to declare their social position. Sorry, I'm poor, can you give me something to help me out? And the radical other element of it, of course, is to say that if those young white kids or middle class are politicized by this process, absolutely, perhaps they will be in the vanguard transforming the idea of society in a very different kind of direction. So would you willing, like the Swedes, to be taxed at 75% to finance a welfare state? So it's politics of consciousness as well. And that was just an observation I wanted to make. I always have interesting debates with my students about that. I think that slogan of not performing our poverty is a very important one. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
So now I want to open to the speakers, and that's not now, or it may start now, but at some time in this process, just for you to ponder some of these two questions, and before you leave this room, just to leave some of your thoughts on those two questions. But before that, I want to open it up to the floor, but I'm going to be a little selfish and just ask my question first. Yeah, no, I'm going to go with the crowd, but actually we'll do this. We'll save ours for last, and we'll go with the crowd. So at least get those hands. We're going to do rounds of 4, and then give them an opportunity to answer, and then we'll do the next round of 4. So my first round of 4 were here, in that order. Your hand.
I'm completely in favor of pluralism in the form of diversity of topics and strong relations between different social science departments at universities. But I suppose my question is, there's one thing that's still, I think, missing, and I don't even know if it's a department or where it fits in, but through my studies and through my work now, I consult a lot with government and the policy space, there's just a complete disconnect between all this theory, so Prof. Nick, a lot of what you were talking about now, the ideological, political side of things, and then the actual implementation and capacity side of things. So when you talk about a welfare state or development state, that actually is also something known as a capable state. You can't be welfare development without capacity. And we just don't have that. And so much of this discussion, so you were thinking about the universal healthcare. Personally, in terms of the idea, sounds great. Like, why can't everyone have access to it? But also personally, I do not trust the capacity of our government to get that right. And so this issue of where does the ideology intersect with practicality and implementation, because that surely has to play into your thoughts about what you think should happen. You can't sort of be so ideological and have these radical suggestions, but then actually how does it play out? Because what you think what's going to happen is not actually going to be the outcome if we implement it. So I don't know, is this something that you can teach the bar team? And I say this because I've looked at the policies we make in government, and even there it's so ideological and so detached from actually how you're going to make this change and how you're going to implement it. And so while we're talking, here we had an ideological debate about looking at economics from a philosophical point of view or a social point of view and different things, but where does the practicality come in? Is it in the politics department, the public administration, and how do we get that across? Because I just feel like so much of the conversation, a lot of the thesis full stuff was theoretically brilliant, but practically just didn't.
Sorry, we have to
Sorry.
keep our questions.
Okay. You may go, and then the gentleman here, and then the lady over there. But please keep the questions so we have more time for more people to ask questions also. Thank you, Miko.
Okay. Can I just speak out? No,
Yeah.
Okay, my question is to both professors, Robert and Robert. One, it is right here. Yeah, so the first one has to do with the philosophical part, but talking more to the terms that are used and the units of analysis. Because when we think about Africa, there's different levels of organizations. So what do you have in mind? Like in the European context, there's a talk of like say citizenship or state, nation state, all of those kind of things that are very foreign to the continent. So should we still be sticking to those categories to define the economic understandings of the continent? And the second question has to do with the theorization of Titmuss. Well, I think it's good to start with Titmuss or Beveridge or T.H. Marshall, but at the very same time, we can't stop there and not actually, or take them and apply the thinking in the global south. I think there has to be more theoretical, a different theoretical rapture in thinking through social policies in our context. And by that, I think one of the problems that I see in Titmuss and the rest of the people that were formulating social policies in Britain was the idea of eugenics was central to their project, leading to social Darwinism. So I don't know how their ideas that were suggesting a universalism specific to one context can actually be applied in our context here. It shifts the debate altogether in a different direction. So I just want your thoughts around that.
Okay, my comment or question is related to what he's talking about, and I found your talk extremely fascinating, all of you, which led me to start Googling the etymology of the word economics itself, in which case I found it to be of Greek origin, connected to household economy and so forth, which links it to what we know today as Euro-American philosophy. You can help me there, bro. But that made me think about the discussion you were having, particularly the first speaker when she spoke of economics as imperialism and all of these problems associated with the economics curriculum today, particularly neoclassical economics, and how, as the second speaker began to talk about it in a policy context. And this is what we're taking in the African context and applying. Now, when I had the philosophy side of it, and particularly a perspective of African philosophy from those two fascinating African philosophers, it then got me to realize why we do not have that term economy in any of these two philosophers' works, which says something about, economics as imperialism. So it brought me to a point whereby I started thinking about how we can take this kind of philosophical background, apply it to the context in which we are emerging and working as whatever discipline we're using, because as far as I'm concerned, I'm an economic historian. I find what you were talking about extremely fascinating, what he just said extremely fascinating, and sort of coming up with a general idea of what we should call our own economies. I'm thinking here in terms of what we call the formal and the informal. And I know the informal economy is a concept from 1978 onwards, but even Western scholars have struggled to sort of define what this is. It boggles the mind how an economy like, for example, where I come from, which is Zimbabwe, operates in a way where you have 3 or 4 tier pricing systems. And yet when you're teaching economics, you don't consider all of these dynamics which speak contrary to what we know. What does that say about the way in which we as Africans make sense of the context that we find ourselves having to operate in a context of economics as imperialism? I hope that makes sense.
And our final question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll be so quick. Ruth, because you've worked in the policy space, I sometimes wonder if the difficulty with pluralism within economics and trying to incorporate different social sciences is when someone from a neoclassical background from the World Bank says, these are the 3 things you need to do to ensure that your country succeeds. You need to protect policy rights and you need to ensure that there's free trade. And we come from a social sciences discipline saying it's complex and it's nuanced and it's different and it's context specific. Aren't we just losing the battle when the people who have to make decisions on which policy will be implemented have, this is the simple 3 steps, or this is the really complicated discussion that we need to have. And then to Professor Manika, I can't tell you how deeply passionate I am as a student myself and as a young lecturer in teaching what African economics would be. But up until I played report, I don't know where are the textbooks, where are the journal articles, where are the scholars for me as a young academic to go, this is the textbook I said, this is the articles I want you to read. So I suppose the question I'm probably going to ask in every session that I'm in is where is an online repository for academics that are saying this is what you should potentially teach to African students, to South African students, in acknowledging that we'll teach Matthew, but this is also what you should teach alongside that. So I suppose it's firstly like a compliment, thank you that you know this exists, and thank you for transferring that to us. But where can we get more of it, and how can we make sure more of it gets into the hands of our students?
Maybe it's one.
Sure. I'm trying to think fast. So one thing around, just touch quickly on the question of economic imperialism, the idea behind that is also that these ideas around social and customs and culture, etc., can be brought back to economics. But the logic that's imposed on it, including the methodological logic, is one of economics. And so that there's an imposition of a particular method to analyze elements that may have been considered outside and are brought in but then there's this kind of closing, right, of space and then closing of possibilities of questions to explore. I mean, I think the question around the World Bank, the first thing is institutions like the World Bank are supported by military and economic powers in the world, right? And so when the World Bank comes to a country, it comes with the full force of US imperialism and of course within this sort of frame, right? The countries that have had to negotiate with the bank, it always hasn't always been sort of like even in the negotiation space. And many of the proposals that they put out are really weird and extremely complex. You know, so if you think, for instance, around social welfare, I mean, this whole idea around the targeting of the poorest of the poor, which in a place like Mozambique, where 70% of people are far below the poverty line, right? Who do you identify that is poor? The person with 2 chickens, the person with 1? And when the chicken dies, I mean, but the bank has involved the Mozambican government in very complicated models to try to identify who this group is. And quite frankly, I think that the objective of that is to suck out energy and space, right, from actually building a universal agenda. And that is tried in multiple ways. I think that social sciences can have clear proposals. So I don't think that that's, social sciences, or other social sciences, like economics, engage in some process of abstraction. I think the difference is that with many of the social sciences, we're aware of the limitations, right? So if I do a study, for instance, in 2 rural areas in Mozambique, I'll make some generalizations about that, but I'll be careful about what's signed. But I don't think that other social sciences necessarily propose more complex proposals than these World Bank extremely complicated and often inaccurate forms of targeting.
Thanks. I'll try and be brief for myself. So one question about the NHS and the practicality of it. So that question is an important question. I say what I'm going to say with circumspection is not pejorative. Precisely, it reflects kind of middle class anxiety about now are we expected to go and queue with our children at Baliwan Hospital because we had this big nice thing to go to their care and places. So there's an issue there about the consciousness of the middle class and whether it's in the self-interest of the middle class, given that the inequality we have seen is likely going to lead to fundamental social rupture. It might actually be the land question that's going to lead to that social rupture. And so, from one angle, it is what is in your self-interest at the moment, as some positionality, in terms of this socially organized society that will meet your needs and the needs also of the wider society. So, the middle class is going to have to at least be able to do that. The example of the NHI is to say that if we want to establish universal health service, we have to take away the privilege of tax subsidies we enjoy. We're going to have to remove the tax subsidies from the academics and put it into a common fund, a single fund, single payer model, and get that funds to where it's required in the poor, rural communities, poor urban areas, and build up the stock and the capability. I mean, it takes no rocket scientist to identify why there is a crisis in public healthcare provision. Because in the part need for healthcare, it wasn't segregated, but there wasn't the resources. So 15% of total our spending goes to service 60% of the population. How are you possibly going to meet the needs of that 84% and that remaining 50%? And also, our medical schools train our doctors to go work essentially in the private sector. It's not oriented like in Cuba to community-based medicine. So we find that the dominance of our doctors, specialists, are servicing the private sector. There has to be a complete revolution in our thinking around healthcare. I mean, one model that has been proposed is primary healthcare approach, which is much more about community-based healthcare. But if you think this idea is a new idea, it's a very old idea. It's in the 1940s, the Blackburn Commission was arguing for the nationalization of the healthcare system. It said, precondition for establishing quality healthcare for all citizens, you have to nationalize healthcare. Being specifically meant, the commission is specifically meant taking away control of the big tertiary hospitals from the provinces, putting it under state control, and essentially getting doctors to be salaried individuals. And that's big. I mean, the segregation here, government commission, that was picked up by Ebi Kuma, who was then the Secretary General of the ANC, the leader of the ANC at the time. Absolutely advocated strongly for a national health service, the Dr. African claim. The Freedom Charter. The Freedom Charter, if you were to implement it, you'd have the first social democratic welfare state in South Africa. Absolutely. There's no doubt about it. You look at someone like Lutuli, who's one of the big leaders of the ANC, he says, the kind of society I'm looking for, you ask me what model it equals, it's at least post-war Britain. Because it's a redistributed model, it's going to meet the needs we see. So these ideas, I sort of, I'm linking it to the point that you're making. I'm thinking about how ideas ferment on a global level, and what we take and engage with what's useful, maybe reject what's not useful. And I'd like to see it as a dialogue. I'm very inspired by it too, because you with great confidence says this is what we want. This very radical social revolution that happened in Britain in the post-war era on the basis of the Labour Party. He spoke confidently about that. But I absolutely also take that point. I mean, the kind of reading political culture I grew up with was people like Amilcar Cabral, which I think is very important. Samora Machel, the French Sandinistas, the thinkers that were happening in Nicaragua in the late 1970s about popular democratic model of socialism, how you achieve that. And we have to infuse that thinking. But for me, I also don't see this as pie in the sky, because it has been done in Africa. It was done in Mozambique under Samora Machel, universalization of healthcare, that's pretty cool. It was done under Agostinho Neto. It was done in the liberated parts of Guinea-Bissau with Amilcar Cabral. So I think some of these ideas do have the possibility, in political terms, of translating it into an agenda that is not just continentally specific, but globally specific. If you ask me, like, where I saw us on the continuum of crises in the world, are we in 1917 with the Bolshevik Revolution, when we stormed the castle? Are we in 1936, when we fighting Franco's fascism to United Front? Or are we at the cataclysm of 1939, which led to the death of 6 million Jews and 20 million Soviet people? I think we're possibly in 1936. So it's also a popular front at the global level of ideas. And we marshal all our resources and our strengths, because I think we've got a bigger enemy. Anyway, those are just some pointed observations.
Okay, thanks. I'll keep to the philosophical questions, which were, I think, the second and third. I'll take them together because I think they're essentially the same question. And I'd like to link up with something Robert just said, which was the translation of ideas. Problem with the translation of ideas and also with ideas. So the second question was, what are the terms of analysis that we should use? Because things like concepts like state, citizenship, etc. are foreign concepts on the continent. And how does one apply social policies in an African context under those conditions? That was the second question. And the third one was, isn't the whole concept of economics, the science itself, an imperial one? And what could an African economics possibly look like with this kind of history, with this kind of origin? There's a mention of formal versus informal economics, etc. So these questions link up to questions which are among the hardest that there are. Literally. I mean, proving a mathematical theorem is nothing against that. We're going to get there with the theorem, but because there are questions about the universality of, I think, of ideas, or not, the universality of concepts, questions about truth versus perhaps the absence of it. And the point of my talk was just to, I don't have answers, but I wanted to sensitize you perhaps to the fact that the way you look at these things is informed by an implicit philosophy that you have, even though you don't realize it. Everyone has an implicit physics, people say. When you get on a bicycle, you do something extremely complicated without even realizing it. And the same thing is just, doing any science, other science. You are doing philosophy, very complicated philosophy too, that you're not realizing. So in the context of 2 and 3, the two philosophers that I spoke about would have different answers. You see, Ntonji would say, surely state and citizenship are concepts that, even though they may not be African in origin, for the Africa of today and for the Africa of tomorrow, will be important, whether you like it or not, because it's a globalized, economy and globalized world. And we, even if they may not be of African origin, they may perhaps be some of the intellectual heritage, the international intellectual heritage that we Africans should take on board, combine with our own heritage, and then move on and build, a Wakanda of the future. Have you noticed Wakanda, by the way? My favorite thing to say about that movie is it was not about African magic. You see, there's a point in the film where the scientist says, "This is not magic. This is science." All the flying things, etc. So there's a very progressive, a very science-focused concept of what modernity for Africa should look like. Very Umtonji-like. Let's take what's there, let's combine it with ours, let's create an African modernity that's new. So he would say, look, yes, it may not be African, but it's useful for us to theorize social policy, for example. So he would be very much on board with Robert and saying, hey, you know what, if the introduction of the NHS in England was successful, let's take the core policy, tweak it around the edges, as we must, when we apply it in South Africa. But it's an excellent idea. It translates, it expresses our values. Let's do it. Chimakonam, I suspect, might say, no, let's go back to and see how Africans used to care for their sick in traditional society. How did they allocate resources? How did they, solve these problems? This is the African way to solve this problem, and now we must simply perhaps modernize it, scale it, upscale it. But let's not copy the West and take what the English have done. That's Western culture. And that may actually not fit in as well with the rest of our culture. So Chimakonam, I suspect, would answer these questions differently. And that is because he has a different philosophy. Now, which one is the better one? Well, that's a question that I think, this is philosophy, the timescale of philosophy is in centuries, I'm afraid. Not even decades, not even years. It literally is centuries. When people who talk about transformation, I think don't realize that the underlying problems are all philosophical, and the decisions to be made of those, the theory to develop is all, that will take centuries. I think, to overcome colonialism, which lasted century, might last centuries too. But one has to start. And the last question was, where are the textbooks? Well, I'm with Umtonji on this. They need to be written yet. And, this is why we are here. We need the next generation to write new textbooks.
Sorry, unfortunately, we have reached 1 o'clock, but I've been told that if the floor would allow it, we can go on for another 15 minutes if there really are questions that people want to ask. But then I'll just have to limit it to 3 questions so we can speed up the process if everyone's okay with that. So I see a hand here, and here.
Talk about what economics can learn from other social sciences. I'm an educationist, and I'm a bit disappointed to see there's no one in education on the panel. Because economics has had such a, it's so closely linked to education and has had such a profound impact on how we understand the purpose of education, which ultimately is a philosophical question, but economists have largely dominated the answer to that question. And it's so clearly illustrated by the Minister of Basic Education 2 days ago talking about World Literacy Day and saying why it's so important that young kids must learn to read so that they can participate in the economy and so that we can stimulate economic growth. And I thought that was such a horrific comment, because surely that's one of the purposes of reading. But ideas and all those other things that come with reading are also really important. So just wanted to flag that that's also a really important conversation to have.
I'm also not asking a question, just sort of manner in the works, because I get uncomfortable with this super romanticization of the African.
And then if there's time, but please, thank you.
So I agree with I don't want to come across that I don't agree with the premise of the discussion that economics has been imperialistic in respect of other social sciences. The over-dominance of economics is a problem and it must learn from other social sciences. But isn't there a danger in this debate that we then throw the baby out with the bathwater? Then we also need to ask, like, what actually is economics contributing and what about it should not be dispensed with too rapidly. So, kind of, if I can say, Marx rejected disciplinary labels, maybe, but amongst other things, he was an economist, or he studied economics. And one of the contributions he made was to say that value and social relations in general are material. You cannot just change them by wishing them to be changed. So, which is about economics saying that when you do these things, when you imagine these alternatives, there are real trade-offs that must be confronted. So, which other social sciences aren't so good at, as economics is. So, and economics has a long history. Neoclassical economics since the Cold War is one item, but yeah. So for example, it's possible to say we must have NHI, and that Britain had NHI and
NHS.
Well, I always think it would be much better if we spoke about NHS than NHI, because as soon as you say NHI, you're financializing it. So I agree with that. So we can have NHS, and the professor there knows. I haven't studied the NHS, but so I'm just grasping at straws. But one of the conditions under which NHS was possible, perhaps, in Britain at the time there was rationing of food. People were making sacrifices. There were sacrifices made by the nation, and particularly by the middle class, to achieve NHS. And sometimes if we don't look and study economics, we can become voluntaristic. Just believe we can create an NHS and we can have free higher education and we can have a basic income grant and we can have everything we want without making any sacrifices. There's that danger that economics helps to avoid. So when we talk about the 20 billion medical tax subsidy, the vast bulk of that money goes to members of COSATU, who we can define and say it's a middle class if we want to. But there's a sacrifice that is entailed there. And maybe we have to locate the sacrifice elsewhere. Maybe we have to locate the sacrifice amongst the very wealthy. But there will be some sacrifice that will have consequences to achieve these things we want. So in a sense, I'm proposing that, isn't that the fundamental issue that other social sciences have to learn from economics?
I respond.
Thank you.
You may respond if you see fit to respond. Okay.
A health private sector provider like Discovery, it's all on a continuum, and it depends on how much you can afford. And most of the site workers can't afford the higher level at which those services are made available. They're very low, all three levels. So just put it more concretely, in university, I was previously part of Rhodes University. It's a differentiated scheme. So I'm part of a closed scheme for academics, and I get actually incredibly good forms of health provision to that. In comparison to workers organizing know-how, who, for example, can only draw down on the medicines provision by going through clicks and twice a year. I don't have that constraint anymore. So it's deeply unequal and differentiating, even within the private model. But the more fundamental thing is about this idea of sacrifices. Because the argument is the poor and working class have been sacrificing. It's a middle class who have been handsomely endowed by the post-apartheid settlement. You know, And if you look at the case of the UK, yes, absolutely, rationing was part of it from 45 to 55 in the context of required austerity. But the funding of the NHS and the welfare state came from an unfavourable loan from the UK. It was only paid off with Gordon Brown.
An unfavourable loan from?
The US, the United
The
States.
US.
The United States gave Britain an unfavourable loan, and that's what the basis on which they part-financed the welfare state. And it was unfavourable because it was only paid off in mid-2000s when Gordon Brown was Prime Minister. In fact, they made a big day of it. They paid off the war loan from their erstwhile kind of comrades in the struggle against fascism. But I think the power of that is precisely that model completely debunks the idea that, well, is it affordable, is it fiscally containable? No, there was a social vision, there was politics that undergirded that social vision, and then there was a question, how the hell are we going to do that? We're going to have to nationalize the coal industry, we're going to have to do a series of things to achieve full employment. Based on full employment, we're going to get the workers much more welfare through an NHS, we're going to get the workers much better educated through comprehensive education system. I mean, the institutional architecture is absolutely clear. And there was an agenda, and as I pointed out in the previous presentation, it's interesting the flow of the policies. It started with Beveridge in 42, the NHS in 43, and then full employment white paper in 1944. So it's about what is our social vision and what is the economics that's going to allow us to do that. And there was boldness in that project in Britain, boldness. And I'm just saying, perhaps we need the same boldness.
Thank you. Are there no more responses from the speakers? Would you like to go first, Rob? And then
Okay, I would like to just quickly address the feminism and Ubuntu or comment. Yeah, well, point taken and well done. You've anticipated what the feminist section sent us. Because this is exactly the question you're asking us. What needs to be done to realize a feminist economic future? Post-capitalist feminist future. And I agree, but I'm neither in a position to speak more sufficiently informed, I suppose. But I agree that prima facie at least, there is a risk at least in of a certain conservatism when one turns to African tradition. As Mutonji says, it is a turn towards the past in his view, and trying to reconstitute, recover something that would be authentically African, but that in his view might not be perhaps adequate to the exigencies of the present anymore. So I think Mutonji would probably look favorably on your comment. Theoretical, there's a lot of research being done that tries to show that, in fact, the pre-colonial African past was a lot more progressive than it would seem, and that the position of women, in fact, in the African traditional society wasn't then as it is today, one of oppression. So there's an empirical question in parts, but it's also perhaps simply a value question: what kind of economy do we want to build? So yes, I agree, by the way, with the previous speaker that economies can't be sort of wished into existence and be successful and deliver what we want them to deliver. There is